It was a hot day. The sun was beating down relentlessly, turning the asphalt into a scorching slab. A police cruiser pulled up on the corner of a quiet street. Officer Randall, a tall man with a strong build and a stern frown, got out of the car. He looked around the area with a displeased expression, as if he was looking for something. His attention was drawn to a boy in a wheelchair, who was walking along the sidewalk with his small, shaggy dog. The boy was smiling. His dog was happily wagging its tail. "Hey, you!" the officers called out roughly, walking towards them. His voice was sharp, causing the boy to stop. "Yes, sir," the boy replied, looking up. Randall approached, stopping in front of him. "Don't you see?" he said, pointing to a small sign across the street. "This is a no-pet zone. You're breaking the rules." The boy was embarrassed, looked at the dog, who was sitting carefree next to him, and quietly said, "Sorry, I didn't know. We just went out for a walk." "You didn't know?" the officers interrupted, an evil grin appearing on his face. "It's your responsibility to know the rules, or do you think they make exceptions for you?" The boy tried to explain that he simply hadn't seen the sign, but Randall wasn't listening. His irritation was growing, as if this scene were a challenge to his authority. "Do you have papers for the dog?" he asked, but without waiting for an answer, he leaned over to look at the car. "This is just my friend," the boy began, but did not have time to finish. Randall sighed in exasperation, straightened up, and took a sharp step forward. His face became sullen. "You know there's a fine for that," he said, looking down at the boy. "And you know what? I think you're ignoring the rules on purpose." The boy fell silent, and his dog whined softly, as if sensing the tension. A moment later, Randall did something that made everyone freeze. He roughly overturned the boy's stroller, sending him tumbling to the sidewalk. The dog lunged for its owner, but the officers brushed it aside as if it were an annoying fly. The move proved fatal. The boy on the ground screamed in panic, but he didn't have time to do anything. Randall's anger, caused by something unknown, turned into an action that changed everything. His face remained cold, as if nothing unusual had happened. "I hope this teaches you to follow the rules," he said, walking back to the car. The crowd gathered around began to whisper. Some took out their phones, filming what was happening, and some tried to help the boy, but everyone had the same expression on their faces. Shock and bewilderment. Why did this happen? Why? And how could a person who was supposed to protect do such a thing? The boy lay on the sidewalk, his stroller lying nearby, upside down, a broken symbol of something that was supposed to help, not hurt. His dog was whining piteously, clinging to him, trying to figure out what was going on. The people around him frowned, hesitant to intervene. Officer Randall stood looking down at the boy, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made everyone uncomfortable. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" Randall said coldly, leaning toward the boy. "But you're not in the neighborhood to do whatever you want." The boy raised his head, his face covered in dust, and his eyes shining with a mixture of fear and confusion. "I didn't mean any harm, sir," he replied quietly. "We were just walking." Randall smirked, a smirk filled with cold contempt. "Walking?" His voice was louder than necessary. "Walking is for those who respect the law, and you seem to think you can do whatever you want. First you ignore the signs, then who knows what else." The boy tried to get up, but his hands were shaking. Randall didn't move, standing right in front of him, as if blocking his way. "I didn't do anything bad," the boy tried to explain again, his voice trembling. "You haven't done anything wrong?" Randall asked, his voice almost a whisper, but there was a threat in the whisper. "Then why are you causing such trouble?" He turned to the crowd that was beginning to gather closer. "Look," he said to the people, his voice growing louder. "A typical example. They think they can do anything, and then they play the victim. It's not fair," the boy said, his voice quiet but firm. "I didn't do anything like that." Randall leaned closer, his face only inches from the boy. "Unfair," he whispered. "You don't even know what unfair is. Maybe you should learn to respect those above you." The words echoed through the crowd, causing a wave of whispers. Someone pulled out a phone and started filming. Randall noticed, but pretended not to notice. Instead, he took a step back, making it clear that his word was the last. "Remember this lesson," he said, straightening up. "The world belongs to those who know their place, and yours is not here." The boy said nothing. His gaze was lowered, but something was boiling inside him. He heard people around him starting to speak out, and it gave him hope that he was not alone. But now he was focused on only one thing: to hold back tears and not let fear take over. The crowd continued to whisper, and some began to complain out loud. Randall felt the situation was spinning out of his control, but instead of stopping, he headed for his car. His movements were quick and nervous, but he tried to maintain the appearance of authority. People were still filming, and he knew that this video would be his weakness. But for now, he was the one calling the shots. But the boy lying on the sidewalk no longer felt so helpless. He saw the eyes of the people in the crowd fill with compassion and determination. This moment was the beginning of something the policeman had not yet realized. The boy Saturday on the sidewalk, his hands shaking but trying not to show it. His dog, like a loyal friend, clung to him. Whining softly, he raised his head to look at the policeman, but was met with a cold and arrogant gaze. Randall's gaze was not full of contempt for the boy as a person, but rather a feeling of superiority that he did not even try to hide. "Do you know why you don't belong here?" he asked, walking slowly in front of the boy, like a teacher lecturing a misbehaving student. "Because you think you can do whatever you want without consequences." The boy swallowed hard, but said nothing. His eyes reflected pain, but also a resilience that ate away at Randall's composure. "Nothing to say," Randall continued, his voice filled with false concern. "Of course, words don't help when you're breaking the law." "I didn't break the law." The boy finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was just taking a walk." Randall stopped, turning sharply to face him. "Just out for a walk," he repeated, drawing out the words as if to emphasize their meaning. "Just out for a walk." It's funny how people like you always have excuses. The crowd around him began to grow, and the air became tense. People were unsure whether to intervene, but their looks became increasingly judgmental. However, Randall didn't seem to notice, or pretended not to. His attention was focused on the boy. "You think you can come here with your—" He paused, as if choosing his words. "Your dog, and not pay attention to the rules. You think there are exceptions for you." Randall, even angrier. "Even your dog doesn't know how to behave," he said, pointing at the animal, probably both master and dog. These words, filled with mockery, echoed through the crowd. Someone in the crowd began to complain, but quietly, so as not to attract attention. The boy tried to say something again, but his voice trembled. "It's not fair." He whispered, his words so low that only Randall could hear them. But even this only served to anger the policeman further. He leaned closer, his face only inches from the boy. "Not fair," he whispered, his voice quiet but full of venom. "You don't even know what fairness is. The world isn't for people like you. You think you're entitled to anything. You're wrong." The crowd began to move closer, and someone picked up a phone and began filming. Others began to talk quietly, their voices growing louder, but Randall didn't seem to notice. His anger blinded him, and the boy's voice became a challenge to him. "Look at you," he continued, his voice growing louder. "You think you deserve equality. Do you know what your problem is? You don't realize that you're really nobody." The words hit the boy harder than his fall, but instead of hanging his head, he raised it, his eyes meeting Randall's. "I am no one," he said quietly but firmly. These words, unexpectedly confident, made Randall freeze for a moment, but instead of stopping, he laughed. This laugh was filled with bitterness and mockery. "You're not nobody," he repeated, grinning. "Then prove it." The words hung in the air like a knife ready to fall, but before the boy could answer, someone from the crowd shouted, "Enough, this is too much." Randall whirled around, his gaze meeting the group of people, who were now clearly on the boy's side. He frowned, realizing that his actions were no longer going unnoticed. The crowd was no longer just a bystander. It was becoming a force, and Randall realized that his power, of which he was so proud, could now be turned against him. The crowd around him was growing denser. People were no longer just watching. Their whispers were growing into a roar of indignation. Randall felt the atmosphere around him shift. He wanted to just leave, but his pride and wounded ego held him back. He was a cop. He had to stay above the rest, even if he felt his power slipping. The boy was still sitting on the sidewalk, his dog standing next to him, whining softly. Its devotion and silent protection seemed stronger than all of Randall's attempts to humiliate its owner. The boy looked at the policeman with weariness, but there was no longer fear in his eyes. The crowd that had gathered behind him seemed to give him strength. "You seem to be losing control," "Officers," a voice said from the crowd. It was a man who stepped forward, his face hard and his gaze accusing. Randall turned to face him, his face pale with anger. "It's none of your business," he replied sharply, trying to maintain his authority. "Maybe not," the man replied, but there was confidence in his voice. "But someone has to say that you've crossed the line." Those words lit a fuse. The crowd began to move closer, their voices growing louder. People took out their phones, recording what was happening. Randall felt his hands begin to shake. He knew he was no longer in control. "Go away," he shouted, trying to regain control. "This is a police investigation. Everyone go home." But no one moved. The crowd continued to stand, their gazes full of condemnation. One by one, people began to shout words of encouragement to the boy. "It was a child," a woman from the crowd shouted. "How could you do this? Where is your humanity?" added another. Randall realized that the situation was getting out of control. His anger gave way to panic. He took a step back, but the crowd was moving closer. His breathing became ragged, and his head began to spin. He looked at the people, at their faces, and realized that no one was looking at him with respect anymore, only with judgment. "You don't understand," he began, his voice shaking. "I'm just doing my job." "Are you doing your job?" a man from the crowd shouted. "Threatening a child and killing his dog is your job." The words were like a blow. Randall wanted to protest, but he knew he had no excuse. He looked at the boy, who was now standing, supported by someone in the crowd. His wheelchair had been lifted, and his dog was pressed against his legs. The boy looked at the policeman with a confidence he had not felt at first. "I'm not afraid of you, the boy said, his voice quiet but firm. The words rang out louder than any other shout from the crowd. Randall felt his world crumbling. His power, his authority, it was all gone. He was no longer a cop. He was just a man who had made a mistake, and now he was standing before a judge he couldn't control. Randall straightened the eye. "You will answer to the law and to all of us." Randall couldn't stand still any longer. He turned and walked quickly toward his car. His face was flushed with shame, his heart pounding like a hammer. He sensed that this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The crowd wasn't going to back down, and he knew the truth would always find a way out. Randall stood by his car, his face still flushed with tension. He felt control slipping away from him, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. The crowd was growing louder by the moment, their eyes burning into him like a bright light from which there was no escape. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure, and turned back to the boy. The boy, now sitting in his stroller, raised his head and looked at the policeman. His face still reflected pain and confusion, but there was no longer fear in his eyes. The crowd behind him stood like an impenetrable wall, ready to support him. The dog, sitting next to him, looked at Randall as if it sensed that it was a threat. Randall snapped, his voice louder than he'd expected. "You thought all these people were going to make you special. You'd still be who you are. Do you know who you are?" The crowd frowned, their attention riveted on every word. People began to whisper, but no one intervened. They wanted to hear what he had to say, to see how far he would go. "You're just a kid who decided the rules don't apply to him," he continued, moving closer to the boy. "You think you can break the law and get away with it because you have a stroller, because you have a dog? No, that's not how it works." The boy sighed and looked straight at Randall. His voice was quiet but confident. "I didn't break anything." To her, "You are the one breaking the rules." The words, spoken with such calmness, were like a slap in the face for Randall. He took a step closer, his hands shaking, but he tried to hide it. His gaze was full of irritation that bordered on rage. "You don't understand rules, but," he said, his voice a whisper but still threatening. "Rules are what I make, and now you're breaking them?" The crowd began to move closer, their whispers growing louder. Someone shouted, "Enough, this is already going beyond all bounds." Randall turned sharply, his eyes meeting the men. He felt his confidence begin to waver, but he couldn't back down. That would mean admitting defeat. "Move away," he said, trying to maintain control. "This is official police business. You don't belong here." But no one moved. People began shouting words of encouragement to the boy. "You should apologize," a woman from the crowd shouted. "You went too far." Randall turned back to the boy, trying to ignore the voices around him. He dropped to one knee to be at eye level. "Listen to me," he said, his voice quiet again. "You can pretend to be innocent all you want, but in this world, you either submit or you're broken. And you know what? I don't think you can take it. The boy looked at him, his eyes shining with tears, but he did not look away. I won't break, he said quietly, but his words sounded louder than any scream. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. This was a moment Randall could no longer ignore. He stood up abruptly, his face red. He took a step back, but every step he took felt like a loss. People were shouting, "Justice!" and "Stop it!" Every voice was a nail in the coffin of his confidence. He turned and walked quickly to his car, slamming the door behind him. His breathing was heavy and his hands were shaking. He glanced in the rearview mirror where he saw the crowd surrounding the boy, cheering him on. It was a moment he would never forget. The moment he realized he had lost control not only of the situation, but of himself. Randall Saturday in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked in the rearview mirror, where the crowd continued to gather around the boy. Its energy was almost tangible, as if every single person was ready to rise up against him. But that wasn't what bothered him most. In the reflection, he saw the boy, sitting up straight and strong, and the look in his eyes. It wasn't the look of the child he just tried to humiliate, but of someone who had seen the truth and was determined to make it known. Randall tried to catch his breath, but his breathing was heavy and ragged. His mind was spinning. Every word, every phrase the boy and the people in the crowd had said, hitting him like hammers. He started the engine, but it couldn't get going. It seemed to him that if he left now, he would lose something important: control, the chance to reclaim his name, his power. Suddenly, the radio rang out of the silence. The sound was sharp, and it made him flinch. He reached for it, but did not pick it up right away. Instead, he looked at it as if it were something foreign, something that no longer belonged to him. But the voice that came from the speaker brought him out of his stupor. "Larson, answer me." The voice was stern and cold. "What's going on? People are filming, and it's already online. Come to the station immediately." His heart sank. He knew this wasn't just a dare. This was the beginning of the end. The video he'd been dreading was already circulating the internet, spreading the truth faster than he could control. He pressed the button and, trying to remain calm, answered. "Everything is under control," he said, but his voice was shaking. "I'll finish this and calm." Immediately, they answered him, "Or you will regret it." The radio went silent, but its words echoed in his head. He looked in the mirror again. The crowd was even larger now, and a figure appeared in its midst that made him tense up. It was a man in a formal suit, tall and stately. He stood out from the rest with his posture and expression. He wasn't just walking, he was moving with purpose, his gaze fixed directly on Randall. Something about the man seemed painfully familiar to Randall. He strained to remember where he had seen that face, but his memory refused to obey. The man kept walking, the crowd parting for him, not in fear, but in respect. Randall felt his hands begin to sweat. He stepped out of the car, trying to maintain a firm posture, but everything inside him screamed that this was a mistake. The man came closer, his eyes fixed, and their meeting was inevitable. "Officer Randall," he said, his voice level but strong. "I think we need to talk." "Who are you?" Randall asked, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to remain confident. "My name is William Jones," the man replied. "I am this family's attorney, and I am here to remind you that you only have one chance to make the right choice." Randall felt a chill run down his spine. This man knew something that could destroy everything. His confidence evaporated, leaving only fear. "I didn't do anything that was illegal." He tried to justify himself, but his words sounded unconvincing. "The law?" Jones asked, his voice lower, but even more menacing. "You talk about the law, and yet you break it. Your power ends here, and if you don't understand that your every move is now under public scrutiny, you'll only paint yourself further into a corner." The crowd began to whisper louder, people writing down every word. Randall felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. He needed to do something, but he didn't know what. This man was more than just a lawyer. He was a symbol that his actions would not go unpunished. "I'm warning you," Randall said, trying to maintain some measure of control. "Go away. This is a police matter." But Jones didn't move. His gaze was cold, almost contemptuous. "This is not a matter for the police," he replied. "This is a matter for truth, and truth always wins." Those words, spoken with such certainty, were like the final blow. Randall could no longer deny the obvious. His world was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do about it. He stepped back, his breathing quick and ragged. He knew his time was up. Randall stood transfixed, his gaze darting between the crowd, the man in the suit, and the boy who now stood firmly in his place. It was as if everything around him had frowned in anticipation, except inside Randall. There was a hurricane raging, his heart was pounding, his ears were ringing, and his fingers were twitching nervously as he gripped his belt. He was cornered, like an animal who knows there is no escape. The crowd was closing in, its energy now visible. People were no longer just filming. They were making their outrage loud and clear. Someone shouted, "Enough!" Another added, "This is not a law. This is lawlessness." The words struck Randall like hammer blows, breaking his defenses. He felt his confidence slip away, leaving only fear, icy and all-consuming. "You think you can humiliate people and get away with it," the man in the suit said. He stepped forward, his posture unwavering, his face calm. "It was your choice, officers, but every action has its price." "I acted within the law," Randall said through gritted teeth, trying to maintain some of his authority, but even his own words rang hollow. "Within the law?" the man asked, his voice as cold as a blade. "Then why do your actions provoke such hatred? Why are hundreds of people watching this live right now, seeing everything you're trying to hide?" Randall turned, his eyes darting from one face to another in the crowd, which now looked like a single entity. Their cameras were pointed at him like accusing signposts, recording his every move, his every word. He felt sweat trickling down his forehead and wiped it away with a shaking hand. He wanted to say something, but the words were stuck in his throat. "You need to apologize," the man said calmly but firmly. "It's the only thing you can do to somehow fix this situation." I didn't do anything I should apologize for." Randall tried to justify himself, but even he realized how pathetic his words sounded. "Nothing," a voice came from the crowd. It was a woman who stepped forward. Her eyes were blazing with anger, and there was pain in her voice. "You humiliated a child. You humiliated all of us. And you think this is a nothing?" These words caused a murmur of approval among the assembled. Randall felt the ground slipping from under his feet. He looked again at the boy, who now looked at him with firm confidence. That look, devoid of fear, was a final blow for him. "You lost," the boy said suddenly, his voice quiet, but with such confidence that Randall felt his body break out in a cold sweat. Those words weren't just words, they were a sentence. The crowd began to shout condemnation, their anger growing louder, and Randall knew he had no way out. The man in the suit took another step forward. "Officer Randall," he said, his voice louder than the roar of the crowd, "you can't hide from the truth, and it's catching up with you." The crowd roared, shouting words of encouragement for the man and the boy. In that moment, Randall felt as if everything he had ever thought was his had been shattered. His power, his confidence, his status, all vanished in an instant. He was no longer an officer's, but simply a man cornered by his own actions. He took a step back, his breathing ragged. He wanted to run, but he knew there was no escaping the truth. The crowd was relentless, their eyes full of judgment and determination. Randall took another step back, but his back hit the car. He was trapped in a trap of his own making. The man in the suit stopped, his gaze hard but not angry. He raised his hand, calling for silence from the crowd. "You may leave, officers," he said, "but this is not the end. You will be held accountable for every action you take." The words struck like the final blow. Randall looked at the man, and at the boy, then at the crowd. He knew he had lost. He lowered his head, opened the car door, and climbed behind the wheel. His fingers shook as he tried to start the engine. He drove away, leaving behind only the whispers of a crowd that was no longer afraid to speak. But he knew that this day had changed everything, for him and for those who were no longer prepared to remain silent. Randall sped through the city streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly the skin on his knuckles was white. The screams of the crowd echoed in his head, each one tearing at his consciousness like hammers driving nails into his illusion of control. He tried to focus on the road, but faces kept popping into his head. Boy, his dog, the crowd, the man in the suit. Their condemning gazes stayed with him, even after he had driven far from the scene that had become the scene of his defeat. Randall turned onto an empty street, empty of cars and people. He stopped, turned off the engine, and rested his head on the steering wheel. His breathing was heavy, ragged, as if he had just run a marathon. Suddenly, he didn't know what to do next. His life, his confidence, his status, all of it seemed to have dissolved in an instant, and with it, his sense of safety. He raised his head and looked into the rearview mirror. In the reflection, he saw himself, his face covered in sweat, his eyes filled with fear and fatigue. He barely recognized himself. Just yesterday, he had been the one who felt strong, the one who could dictate the rules, and now, he had become the symbol of everything people hated. Suddenly, his phone rang. The sound cut through the silence, startling him. He reached for the phone, but his hands were shaking. When he finally picked it up, his boss's name appeared on the screen. He hesitated, but pressed the accept button. "Randall," came the cold voice of the chief. "Do you realize what you've done?" I was just trying to follow protocol," Randall replied, but his voice was shaking, and even he didn't believe his own words. "Protocol," the boss's voice became sharper. "You have turned your work into a farce. These videos are everywhere. The media is demanding your resignation. People are demanding your arrest. Do you realize what you have done?" Randall paused. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. He knew that excuses wouldn't help. "I want you back at the station immediately," the chief continued, "but be prepared. It's not work that awaits you. It's an investigation that awaits you. And believe me, it won't be in your favor." The call ended. Randall lowered the phone, his hand starting to shake again. He knew he couldn't escape what was coming. His actions could no longer be hidden, and now he was alone in the face of the truth. At this point, the boy, his dog, and the crowd were still at the scene. People began sharing their stories, some telling stories of how they had experienced injustice, others shouting words of encouragement to the boy. The man in the suit stood next to him, his gaze focused. "This is just the beginning," he told the boy, his voice soft but confident. "We will show the world that such actions will no longer go unpunished." The boy looked at him, hope in his eyes. It was hard for him to comprehend that he was part of something bigger, but it felt right. The crowd began to disperse, but the energy that had been there did not disappear. It spread across the city streets, across phone screens, across news pages. The story began to gain momentum, and each new person who heard it became part of the movement for truth. Randall walked back into the station. As soon as he walked in, his colleagues' eyes were on him. No one spoke, but their silence was louder than any words. He walked to his desk, trying not to make eye contact, but he felt judged with every step. He sat down, his shoulders slumped, his expression exhausted. He knew this wasn't just a day at work. This was his last day as who he thought he was. But deep inside, Randall began to feel something else. It wasn't just fear or shame. It was the realization that he had ruined his life, his beliefs. He looked at his reflection in the computer monitor. The man he saw was not the man he wanted to be, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like that image would stay with him forever. Randall sat at his desk, staring at the blank computer screen. The silence in the room only added to his anxiety. His colleagues were no longer trying to hide their attitudes. Their eyes were filled with judgment, and it felt as if he were under a microscope. Everything that had seemed so sure and unshakable before was crumbling around him. The phone on his desk rang again. He jumped in surprise and did not pick it up right away, taking a breath to somehow cope with the rising fear. He answered, "Officer Randall." His voice was taut as a string. "Larson," came the voice on the other end of the line, low and commanding. It was his uncle, District Attorney Jonathan Randall. "I just saw the video. What the hell did you do?" Randall frowned. His fingers trembled, and the pipe almost fell from his hands. He had never heard such a tone from his uncle, cold, stern, as if nothing depended on him now. I don't know what to say," he muttered. "This is all out of control." "Out of control?" Jonathan's voice was steely. "Do you realize that you've become a symbol of what I've been fighting my entire life? The video is all over town now. People are demanding justice. They're demanding your head, Larson." Randall swallowed, feeling cold sweat trickle down his back. He tried to justify himself. "I was just trying to follow protocol," he began, but his voice was shaking. "Protocol," Jonathan interrupted. "You tried to assert your power at the expense of a child. You don't even understand what you've done, and now I have to clean up the mess." Randall fell silent. He knew he had no more excuses, but the fear of what would happen next paralyzed him. "You realize I've been dragged into this," Jonathan continued. "People are asking how I can allow this to happen to my family, and now they're expecting me to do something." "You're my uncle," Larson whispered. "You can help me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jonathan sighed, his voice growing even colder. "Help," he said. You don't even realize that this isn't about me. This is about the truth. And if you think I'm going to cover for you, you're wrong. I can't let your actions go unpunished. You chose this path, Larson." The conversation ended. Jonathan hung up, leaving Larson sitting in silence. His hands were shaking, and he felt like the whole world around him had gone gray and empty. Meanwhile, the boy watched his story unfold in his room, his family by his side, and Jones, his attorney, confidently plotting his next steps. The video went viral. People from all over the country offered words of support, expressing their outrage at Randall's actions. Activists, journalists, and even politicians began to take notice. "We're not going to stop until we get justice," Jones said, addressing the boy's family. "This isn't just about you. This is about everyone who experiences this kind of injustice, knowing they're not alone." The boy felt a slight tremor in his chest. He never thought he would be a part of something so big, but now he knew his voice mattered. The next day, Larson was called into the boss's office. As soon as he walked in, the atmosphere in the room became heavy. The boss was sitting at his desk, and Jonathan Randall was standing across from him. Larson frowned, his eyes darting between them. "Larson, sit down," the boss said, his voice firm. "We need to discuss what happens next." I'm ready to explain everything," Larson began, but his uncle interrupted him. "No need," Jonathan said coldly. "It's all clear now. Your actions are recorded, and the consequences are inevitable. But you're my uncle," Larson tried to object. "That's why I'm here," Jonathan replied, "to make sure everything is fair. And believe me, Larson, fairness is the last thing that will work in your favor." Larson felt the ground shift beneath him. His fear had become reality. He was no longer protected by his uniform or his bonds. Everything he had done was now his doom. Randall Saturday in his boss's office, his face pale and his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of his chair. Just recently, he had felt like he was on top of the world, the man who could dictate the rules and punish those he thought broke them. But now his confidence had evaporated like the morning mist. In its place, there was only fear, a suffocating, icy fear that seemed to fill his entire being. The warden Saturday, behind a massive wooden desk, his gaze hard and piercing. Beside him stood Jonathan, his uncle, his face impassive but his eyes a mixture of frustration and anger. Randall knew he couldn't hide here. These men weren't just observers. They were judges whose verdicts would be decisive. "Do you understand the situation you're in?" the chief began sharply. His voice was as cold as a winter wind. "This isn't just a mistake. This is a breach of trust. This is a disgrace to the entire service." Randall wanted to say something, but his throat was dry. His tongue felt heavy and the words wouldn't come. He knew that every excuse he made would sound pathetic and ridiculous. "You didn't just break the law," the chief continued, his voice growing louder. "You ruined a child's life. You humiliated him, and all this for what? To prove your power." I was just trying to follow protocol," Randall finally managed to say, but his voice was weak, like a whisper. Jonathan, who had been silent until now, leaned forward, his gaze becoming even more intent. "Protocol," he said slowly, as if considering each word. "You mean to say that your actions are protocol? You call attacking a child, killing his dog, humiliating himself in front of a crowd protocol?" The words struck Randall like lightning. He lowered his head, avoiding his uncle's gaze. He wanted to disappear, to dissolve into thin air, so as not to hear these accusations anymore. But reality was merciless. "Did you think no one would notice?" Jonathan continued. "Did you think your uniform would protect you? You were wrong. The video is already out there. People are demanding justice, and I will be the first to make sure they get it." Randall's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. He looked at his boss, hoping for some glimmer of compassion, but there was only cold determination. "You are no longer an officer," the chief said. "You are no longer part of this service. From now on, you are an ordinary person who must be held accountable for your actions." Those words were the final nail in the coffin of his confidence. Randall felt his breathing become ragged, and his hands began to shake even more. He tried to say something, but his voice was so weak that his words were drowned out by the silence. "Get out of this office," the boss added, "and be prepared for what's coming next." Randall stood up, his legs feeling like jelly. He took a few shaky steps toward the door, his breathing growing faster. He no longer felt like a man in control of his own destiny. He was now a prisoner of his mistakes. When he left the office, The corridor seemed endlessly long. Colleagues who had respected him before, or at least pretended to, now looked at him with condemnation or turned away altogether. Each glance was like a stab in the back. He felt fear taking hold of him more and more. He went outside, where another blow awaited him. The crowd gathered outside the station began to shout his name. The journalist cameras were aimed directly at him. Their flashes blinding. People were shouting, "Justice," and "Shame." He tried to walk through them, but every step seemed like torture. The crowd was like a living thing, surrounding him, not allowing him to breathe. Randall realized that there was no longer any place he could hide. His fear reached a peak, turning into an awareness of his own vulnerability. He was no longer an officer's, no longer a defender of the law. He had become a symbol of what people were now rising up against. Randall ran down the street, leaving behind him a crowd of people who roared with condemnation. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst. Cameras, flashes, loud voices, it all haunted him like a nightmare. He hid in a dark alley, trying to catch his breath. His hands were shaking, and his thoughts were chaotic. Just recently he had been sure of his inviolability, of his power, but now that world had collapsed, leaving him alone to face the truth. Meanwhile, the boy Saturday on the couch in the living room of his home. Around him were his parents, Jones, his attorney, and several reporters who had come to interview him. It seemed as if the entire country knew his name. His story, the video taken that day, went viral. Millions watched as an officer overturned his stroller. As his dog was mercilessly killed, the boy's story became a symbol of the fight for justice, for equality, for everyone's right to be heard. "We're not going to stop until we get the truth," Jones said firmly to reporters. His voice was calm and confident, but there was a sense of determination in it. This family deserves justice. This boy deserves to have his voice heard. The boy listened to the adults discuss his case, but his mind was elsewhere. He remembered those moments on the sidewalk when he felt helpless and humiliated. But now he knew he was not alone. The crowd that stood up for him, the people who began writing him words of encouragement, the lawyer who became his advocate, all of this gave him strength. "I just want this to never happen to anyone again," he said quietly, his voice weak but firm. Those words were heard. Reporters recorded his every word. Cameras captured his face of determination. The boy's story became personal for many. People from all over the country shared their stories, telling of the injustices they had faced. The boy's story became a catalyst for change. At this time, Randall, sheltered in his home, Saturday in front of the television, the news was playing on the screen, discussing his actions. Every word was a blow. Policeman exceeds authority. Humiliation of defenseless child. When uniforms become a cover for cruelty, the headlines flashed before his eyes. He realized that his name had become synonymous with injustice. His phone was ringing off the hook, but he didn't answer. He knew it was his bosses, his colleagues, people who had once considered him part of the system, but now he was a burden to them. No one wanted to deal with a man who had ruined everything with his cruelty and stupidity. Meanwhile, Attorney Jones received an important message. He looked at his phone screen, his face lighting up with satisfaction. "We did it," he said, turning to the boy's parents. "The prosecutor's office has opened a formal investigation against Officer Randall. His actions will not go unpunished." The boy's parents hugged each other, their eyes full of tears. The boy, hearing these words, felt hope rising in his chest. This was not the end, but it was a step forward. He knew that the truth was now on his side. The crowd gathered outside the police station continued to grow. People demanded justice, their voices merging into a powerful chorus. Activists, representatives of public organizations, and ordinary citizens sided with the boy. They held signs with the slogans, "Justice for all," "Stop the cruelty," "Everyone's voice matters." Randall watched on TV, his face blank. He realized there was nothing he could do now. He had become a symbol of everything people wanted to change, and he knew his time was up. But the boy, sitting in his home, felt that his story was just the beginning. He knew that his voice was part of something bigger. He was part of a movement that would change the world. The day dragged on, and the tension in the air became almost palpable. The entire city seemed to be waiting. The boy's story and Randall's actions became the subject of discussion on every corner. People argued, were outraged, shared their thoughts on social media. Randall's name was everywhere, not as the name of an officer's, but as the name of a man who had become a symbol of wrong. Randall Saturday in his living room, surrounded by a silence that was more oppressive than the screams of the crowd outside the station the day before. His home no longer felt like a sanctuary, it felt like a cage, with walls made of his mistakes. His phone was on the table, but he didn't dare pick it up. Every ring, every flash of light on his screen made him flinch. He knew there would be more hate messages. He'd seen the threats in the comments, seen people posting his address, calling for him to be punished for everything. The TV showed the boy again. His face was serious, but there was a strength in it that Randall hadn't seen before. His parents were sitting next to him, and his lawyer, Jones, was speaking with confidence and firmness. The report was accompanied by footage from the scene, where the crowd continued to gather, demanding justice. Randall turned off the TV, but the silence that followed was even worse. Meanwhile, a crowd of journalists and activists had gathered in the city hall. Jones stood in front of microphones and spoke about what had happened. "This isn't just about what happened to this boy," he said, looking around the room. "This is about how things like this happen every day. This is about how the system that's supposed to protect sometimes becomes a source of fear and injustice. We won't stop until we make a difference." People applauded, supporting his words. The boy Saturday nearby, and although he felt tired from all this fuss, he knew it was important. He saw how his story inspired others, how it became part of something bigger. At that moment, the phone rang again in Randall's house. This time, he couldn't ignore it. He picked it up, and his boss's voice cut through the static. "Larson, you need to come down to the station," the chief said. His voice was short and dry. "We've got orders from the prosecutor. You need to give an official statement. And, Larson, get ready. This isn't going to be easy." Randall felt his heart tighten. He knew it was inevitable. He knew what was coming, and yet he was afraid, not for his job, which he had already lost, or for his name, which had been destroyed. He was afraid of having to face the reality of his actions. When he arrived at the station, he was greeted in silence. His colleagues did not look him in the eye. He went into the office where the prosecutor, his uncle, was waiting for him, his face expressing only cold determination. "Sit down, Larson," Jonathan said, pointing to the chair opposite. Randall Saturday up, his hands shaking. He could feel the tension filling the room. "Do you understand what happened?" Jonathan began, his voice quiet but firm. "Do you understand that your actions did more than just break the law? You destroyed people's trust in the system you were supposed to protect." I don't know what to say," Randall replied, his voice almost a whisper. "You'd better not say anything," Jonathan said, "because every word you say can only make your situation worse. This is not a case where you can weasel your way out of it. People demand the truth, and they will get it." Randall felt the fear take over him completely. He saw in his uncle's eyes that no amount of ties would save him. Jonathan stood up, his posture as rigid as stone. "You will go to court," he said, "and you will answer for everything you have done." The words sounded like a death sentence. Randall wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. He knew it was the end, but he also knew it wasn't the end for the boy. His story had already changed a lot, and it was continuing to change the world around him. Randall Saturday in a small, empty office, lit only by a dim lamp on his desk. He felt like the walls were slowly closing in around him. His face was blank, but inside, a storm was raging. He felt his life crumbling, everything he had built turning to dust. He was no longer an officer, no longer a man to be looked up to. He was an outcast, a symbol of injustice, shunned even by those who had once called him a friend. There were papers on the table for him to sign. They were the official papers of his dismissal and a summons to appear in court in a week, not just as a former officer, but as a defendant. His actions were now being viewed as a violation of human rights. Randall read the lines, but they blurred before his eyes. His hands shook as he picked up the pen, but he knew this was only the beginning of the end. At this time, the boy and his family were preparing for another press conference. Jones held a statement in his hands that was to be read out in front of hundreds of cameras. This statement became a symbol of the victory of justice over cruelty. The people in the room waited for his words, their eyes filled with hope. When the lawyer began to speak, everyone frowned. "Today we take an important step toward justice," he said, his voice firm but sincere. "This case has shown that the system is not perfect, but it can change. We have proven that every voice counts, that even those who consider themselves untouchable must be held accountable for their actions. People applauded, their faces shining with hope. The boy, sitting next to his family, smiled. He knew it hadn't been easy, but his story had become part of something bigger. He had managed to change not only his own life, but also to inspire others. Meanwhile, Randall Saturday in his car, parked on an empty street. He felt trapped, his breathing ragged. He wanted to escape, to go somewhere far away, to start over, but he knew it was impossible. He knew his face was now known to everyone, his name a byword for shame. Even if he left, the truth would catch up with him. His phone rang again. This time it was his lawyer. "Larson," said the voice on the other end of the line, "we need to discuss your defense strategy. You realize you have almost no chance." "I understand," Randall replied, his voice weak. "But what should I do?" "The only thing you can do," said the lawyer, "is to admit your guilt. This will mitigate your punishment, but will not save you from it." The words hit him like a blow. Randall hung his head. His shoulders slumped. He knew he couldn't change anything anymore. When he arrived at the station where he was expected to be interrogated, he saw a crowd at the entrance. People had gathered again, holding signs demanding justice. Their gazes, directed at him, were full of condemnation. They were silent, but their silence was louder than any scream. Randall walked past, trying not to look at them, but he felt their gazes like sharp knives. As he entered the building, he was met by officers who silently showed him the way. He was alone. The one who once stood at the top had now fallen below them all. He was taken to an interrogation room. Dim lights, a cold table, cameras recording his every move. The prosecutor walked in, his Uncle Jonathan, but his face was emotionless. He was no longer a relative. He was a representative of the law. "Larson," he said, sitting down opposite, "you'll have to answer for everything." Every word was like a blow. Randall felt his world crumble completely. He knew he couldn't fight anymore. His voice was weak when he started to speak. "I admit my guilt," he said. "I made a mistake." The words were liberating, for the boy, for his family, for those who fought for justice, and even for Randall himself, who finally realized his vulnerability. The trial was set for the following week, but the outcome was clear. Randall stood in isolation, a symbol that even those who once thought themselves the strongest could be held accountable. His fear was now his only companion, but it was not simply fear of punishment. It was fear of the truth, which always finds a way. Friends, write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced injustice or racism in your life? Your stories and opinions are incredibly important to us, as they help raise such important topics. We really appreciate each of you and thank you for your activity and support. If you want to see more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel, like and share the video with your friends. Together we can change the world for the better. Have a nice day and may justice always prevail.